Welcome to the third lecture in a short series on the Paris Peace Conference. Today we are going to examine the question of how satisfied was America with the Paris Peace Conference. Firstly, we will examine America's key aims for the conference. Then we will examine the parts that the American President Woodrow Wilson was most satisfied with. Before examining the parts of the peace conference that he was least satisfied with, we will then evaluate the extent to which the peace conference met America's key aims, and evaluate a political cartoon relating to the new League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson was the American president, was the leader of the Democrat Party. America didn't join the war until 1917, and lost the least number of soldiers, numbering between 100 and 120,000 men. Furthermore, America had actually profited from World War I. This is because American loans had funded the arms race in Europe, including loans to Germany to build up their navy, before America joined the war on the side of the Allies. This means that there wasn't as much at stake for America as there was for Britain and France. Despite being president of the nation with the least amount of vested interest, Woodrow Wilson nonetheless wished to be a heavyweight at the Paris Peace Conference. Wilson saw his role as being a mediator and peacekeeper between the European nations. As such, he set out his desires in what became known as Wilson's 14 points. These outlined his vision for a just and lasting peace after World War I. Wilson's first and most foremost aim was a desire to achieving lasting peace in Europe. His 14 points outlined ways in which this could be achieved. For example, the use of open and honest treaties, rather than secret pacts among nations. He also wanted there to be collective disarmament. This meant that all European nations would collectively agree to reduce their military and munitions. Another of Wilson's 14 points related to self-determination for Central European nations. Following defeat in World War I, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires had both collapsed. Wilson wanted this to be an opportunity for nations to regain their independence, and even for new nations to form. They would be self-governed and so not rely on an imperial power. Similarly, Wilson also wanted Germany's colonies to become independent nations rather than being absorbed by the larger empires of either France or Britain. Finally, Wilson believed that the only way to achieve lasting peace was through freedom of the seas. In other words, all seas and oceans that were not directly owned by a territory should be made available freely for traders of all nations. He also believed these routes should be allowed to stay open during wartime, and that war should not be fought on the water. This was relevant to World War I since Britain had used a naval blockade to prevent Germany from gaining access to essential supplies. Wilson believed that this type of action should not be allowed under international law. Let's now examine the ways in which Woodrow Wilson was satisfied by the Paris Peace Conference. First and foremost, Woodrow Wilson's biggest achievement was the creation of the League of Nations. This was the precursor to the UN. It was essentially a large assembly of representatives of nations from across the world, and it was designed to use diplomacy and discussion to overcome conflict. It was also designed to prevent the need for countries to build up alliances against one another, which had been a main cause of World War I. Secondly, Woodrow Wilson would have been pleased with the creation of a number of independent nations in Central and Southern Europe, following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. For example, Czechoslovakia was created as a new nation in Central Europe. However, there were many ways in which Woodrow Wilson was dissatisfied with the Paris Peace Conference. For example, the German colonies became mandates of the League of Nations, which meant they were essentially placed under control of Britain, or France, and treated like one of their colonies. Similarly, Wilson failed to convince Lloyd George that freedom of the seas was necessary for lasting peace. As a result, Britain maintained their naval supremacy, and the high seas became a key battleground during World War II. Thirdly, Woodrow Wilson was dissatisfied with the reparations bill. It was far too high for Germany to make the repayments, and so she would sink into a debt trap. This would make Wilson's main aim of achieving a lasting peace in Europe far less likely. This proved correct when in 1923 the German economy collapsed, resulting in eye-watering levels of hyperinflation, and Germany had to rely on American loans as a bailout. Furthermore, the desperate economic situation that Germany was placed into following World War I became the main long-term cause of Hitler's rise to power. Finally, Woodrow Wilson suffered a major blow from the American Senate. Republican senators put up a huge resistance to America joining the new League of Nations. They wanted America to follow a policy called isolationism, whereby they did not become involved in international conflicts. This was a policy of self-preservation in order to best serve the American economy. It had support from the American public, who did not believe American soldiers should lose their lives in a conflict that took place in Europe, or indeed elsewhere in the world. As a result, the Senate voted for America to remain outside of the League of Nations, shattering Wilson's dreams of being an international peacemaker and mediator. Let's now examine how satisfied Woodrow Wilson was with the negotiations of the Paris Peace Conference. Firstly, he would have been pleased to see the creation of a League of Nations, especially given that most countries in the world joined as members of the Assembly. However, the Senate prevented America from joining the League, and this meant that Wilson could not play an active role in its foundation to ensure its success. Similarly, he would have been happy to see many smaller nations establish themselves following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, as this met his key aim of self-determination. However, the German colonies were turned into mandates of the League, essentially placing them under British and French control. Furthermore, Britain was able to maintain naval supremacy, so Wilson was unable to achieve his key aim of establishing freedom of the seas. Therefore, it is fair to say that Woodrow Wilson gained very little from the Paris Peace Conference. One could argue, though, that the American Senate was satisfied, since the nation could enter the 1920s with a policy of isolationism. Let's now examine a British cartoon that mocks Woodrow Wilson's key aims for the Paris Peace Conference. Woodrow Wilson is blowing bubbles out of a bowl labeled idealism. The word idealism refers to when someone holds a perfect and unobtainable dream. Each of the bubbles could represent Wilson's 14 points, showing that they were unobtainable, given the climate of the Paris Peace Conference. The largest bubble is labeled the League of Nations. This shows that even in the early months of its creation, many people held doubts that the League of Nations would succeed. We will be examining the flaws of the League's foundation in detail in a following lecture. Let's now examine the provenance. The cartoon was created in 1919 and released in a British newspaper. This shows that the British public perceived Wilson's aims as unrealistic, and they were also cynical about the new League of Nations. Much of the British public wanted to see Germany and her allies punished due to the lives lost in the war, and so were not open to the concept of reconciliation and diplomacy. Let's now return to our overarching question of How satisfied was America with the Paris Peace Conference? Firstly, it's important to remember that Wilson came to the Paris Peace Conference with his 14 points, which were an idealistic set of goals aimed at achieving a lasting peace. The biggest of Wilson's victories was the creation of a League of Nations. This allowed countries from all across the world to sit down at a table and discuss their problems, with the collective aim of de-escalating conflict. However, Wilson did not achieve all his 14 points. Britain resisted the notion of freedom of the seas, and Germany's colonies did not achieve self-determination or full independence. Worse still, the Senate prevented America from joining the League of Nations, so Wilson was unable to have any real influence in its critical early days. Therefore, it is fair to say that Woodrow Wilson was dissatisfied with the Paris Peace Conference. This is because he came into the negotiations with unrealistic and idealistic aims, especially given the mood in Europe following the war. Clemenceau especially was not going to compromise in the hope of a lasting peace, given his strong desire for vengeance. Thank you for watching. Tune into my other lectures in this series to learn about how satisfied Britain and France were with the Paris Peace Conference. Alternatively, tune into my next lecture to learn about the different treaties that were signed with Germany's allies, such as Austria and Turkey.